Welcome to the study of the book and the message of Obadiah. The kingdom belongs to Yahweh. That's the message. The book of Obadiah is by far the shortest book in the First Testament. It consists of only 291 words. This tractate is slightly more than half the length of Nahum, the next shortest, 558 words, but only 1.3% of Jeremiah, the longest book, 21,819 words. And remarkably, this short book, 1.3% of Jeremiah, borrows so much from Jeremiah, the longest book. In the Hebrew Bible, Obadiah is the fourth book in a collection known as the Book of the 12, sandwiched between Amos and Jonah. However, in the Greek First Testament, that is the Septuagint, Obadiah is found between Joel and Jonah, a different location. Now, in recent years, it has become fashionable to view the Book of the 12 as an intentional literary composition. These 12, of course, are the 12 minor prophets. But some view this as an intentional, coherent composition with a coherent plot, coherent themes, coherent literary patterns that signal that those who collected these works intended the whole corpus to be read as a unit. As for Obadiah itself, verses 1 to 5 are heavily dependent on Jeremiah 49:9, and 14 to 16 have been adapted to imitate Amos 9:1 to 4, and 8 to 14 represent a mosaic of anti-Edom oracles drawing on Isaiah and Ezekiel and composed for the Book of the 12. That's how some people interpret all of this. But this approach has recently come under increasing criticism. Not only was the arrangement of the books that make up the Book of the 12 quite fluid in antiquity, they were put in different orders in different places, but the Hebrew Bible places Obadiah after Amos logically because this book concerns Edom, which is the subject of the last verses of Amos in 9:11 to 15. Although the canonical placement of Obadiah after Amos invites us to read this book in the light of Amos, more generally, the separate historical and cultural circumstances of each of the prophetic books that make up the 12 provide a more important control for interpreting these books than their location in the canon. These are all separate compositions that have been brought together. In the absence of references to these prophets elsewhere, so the best clues for reconstructing the circumstances for each prophetic series of utterances are found within the books themselves and in the superscriptions that open the books. For example, although the superscription to the book of Isaiah invites us to read the whole book as a collection of oracles by the prophet who lived at the end of the 8th century BC, it is conceivable that the present literary work, especially chapters 40 to 66, was produced in the context of the Judeans' return from the exile in the middle of the 6th century BC, when the significance of these earlier prophets was realized. So the prophecies were given at a certain time, but the books were put together at a later time. Furthermore, we need to distinguish between the prophet responsible for the oracles in the book and the person who produced the book as we have it. Based on the use of the first person in Ezekiel, we may argue that the prophet Ezekiel was involved in the transcription, collection, and arrangement of the oracles in the book named after him. For instance, in this book, we have over and over again, dozens of times, the word of the Lord came to me, saying. And it sounds like Ezekiel is writing this down himself. But the third person introduction to Obadiah, the vision of Obadiah. He doesn't say my vision. The vision of Obadiah suggests someone other than the prophet himself had the final hand in the production of the book as we have it. But let's talk now about the historical background to Obadiah's prophecies. Even if the opening lines offer the best clues to the provenance of the biblical book, we must ask whether the circumstances noted in the introductions to the books apply to the delivery of the oracles or to their transcription and incorporation into the written document before us that we are reading. As is common, scholars are not agreed on the date or the circumstances of Obadiah's preaching. 6 main theories have been proposed. First, some argue for a date in the early 9th century BC. In Jewish tradition, the present prophet is identified with a steward named in the court of Ahab, who had the same name, 1 Kings 18, 1-15. Second, mid-9th century BC. According to 2 Kings 8, 20-22, compare 2 Chronicles 21, 8-20, foreigners invaded Judah and carried off the palace treasures and all the members of King Jehoram's family except Jehoahaz. 2 Chronicles 21:17. A third approach suggests that the book comes from the mid-8th century BC. 2 Chronicles 28 reports that during the reign of Ahaz, Syria, that is Aram, and the forces of Israel to the north invaded Judah, slaughtering many and removing 200,000 captives and a great deal of booty to Samaria, verses 5-8, while Edomites and Philistines invaded Judah from the south. There's your connection to Edom. Fourth, some dated to the mid-6th century BC. Assuming that Obadiah ministered in Judah in the wake of the sacking of Jerusalem in 586 and in anticipation of the fall of Edom, most scholars associate the prophecies of Obadiah with those horrific events. This is my view, and I'll come back to that in a moment. Fifth, the mid-4th century BC. Some associate the attack on Edom predicted in Obadiah 1-10 with the Nabatean Arab invasion of Edom. But this seems much too late. A sixth interpretation, it's a combination of 4 and 5. Some agree that Obadiah 1-14 and 15b are dated in the exilic period, that's mid-6th century BC, but they treat verses 15a and 16-21 as late additions from the Persian or even the Hellenistic period, which is very late. Well, we may speculate that the book was produced at a time when Edomites were a problem for those who made up the covenant community in and around Jerusalem. Although Edom as a state seems to have come to an end in mid-6th century BC, the Edomite people did not disappear until the end of the Persian period, late 4th century BC, when they were replaced by Nabatean Arabs. The references to the Edomites as Esau in Malachi, which reflects conditions in the mid-5th century BC, suggests that at this time, the descendants of Esau were still recognizable, even though the land of Edom had become, quote, a wasteland and a desert for jackals, Malachi 1:3. Indeed, the Edomites' encroachment on Judean territory is reflected in the name Idumean in the New Testament, Mark 3, verse 8. Which referred to a region in the Negev south of Judah, Idumea. This suggests that the messages of the prophet would have offered hope to the Judeans long after Obadiah had delivered the oracles. And accordingly, the present written record could have been produced any time from about 550 to 350 BC. Whether or not the book contains all of Obadiah's preaching, we will never know. The present text may serve as a representative sampling of his preaching, edited for literary purposes, though the original oral flavor is still very strong. Whatever the date of the composition of the book, we do best to date the oracles in it to the exilic period, specifically the period between the fall of Jerusalem in 586 BC and Edom's demise at the hands of the Babylonians in 553 BC, somewhere in between there. The terminus a quob, earliest possible date, is established by the image the prophet paints of Jerusalem and her population. Verse 11 speaks of a city that has been invaded by foreigners and its wealth is carried off. It speaks of competing forces casting lots for the booty. Verses 12 to 14 characterize that event as a day of misfortune, ruin, perishing, distress, doom, and disaster. Verse 16 speaks of the day as drinking the cup of divine fury. The image of restoration in verse 19 assumes that the territories of Ephraim, Samaria, and Gilead have been lost to the Assyrians in 732 and 722 BC. While the exiles of this host belonging to the people of Israel in verse 20 could refer to other invasions, an allusion to the Babylonian exile seems the most natural reading. Obadiah does not refer explicitly to the destruction of the temple, but the reference to Zion as a place of refuge and a holy place alludes to the shattered hopes of the Judeans who had viewed the temple as a symbol of security and Yahweh's unqualified support in 586 BC. The image of Edom in Obadiah reinforces the link with the collapse of the Judean state at the hands of the Babylonians. Although the conflict between the descendants of Esau and Jacob has ancient roots and is well documented elsewhere, Amos 1, 11 to 12, Ezekiel 25, 12 to 14, and then Ezekiel 35. But so is Edom's response to Judah in the face of her deepest crisis. Ezekiel accuses Edom of handing over the people of Israel to the sword at the time of their calamity and their final punishment, chapter 35, verse 5, of claiming the emptied lands of Judah and Israel as their own, 35:10, of expressing anger, envy, and hatred toward them, 35:11, and of taunting and celebrating over the desolation of the land, verses 12 and 15. In Joel 4:19, that prophet lays specific and serious charges against Edom. Here's a quotation. Egypt shall become a desolation, and Edom a desolate wilderness, because of the violence done to the people of Judah, in whose land they have shed innocent blood. This picture accords with that of the psalmist, who in Psalm 137, 7-9, recalls Edom's role with intense bitterness. Verse 7, remember, O Yahweh, what the Edomites did on the day Jerusalem fell. Tear it down, they cried, tear it down to its foundation. Daughter Babylon, doomed to destruction, happy is the one who repays you according to what you have done to us. Happy is the one who seizes your infants and dashes them against the rocks. That's a sorry statement and an angry statement. The fourth lament in Lamentations also recalls Edom's involvement in Judah's demise and declares hope in her punishment. Celebrate and be glad, O daughter Edom, you that live in the land of Uz. But to you also the cup shall pass. You shall become drunk and strip yourself bare. The punishment of your iniquity, O daughter Zion, is accomplished. He will keep you in exile no longer. But your iniquity, O daughter Edom, he will punish. He will uncover your sins. Lamentations 4:21-22. To these biblical sources, we may now add significant supporting archaeological data. First, Arad Ostracon 24 from the site of Arad in the Negev, dated early in the 6th century BC, contains an urgent request to Eliashiv for troops to be sent to Arad and Ramath Negev to forestall Edomite aggression in the Negev. Quote, lest Edom should go there. That's in the Ostracon. Second, dated about the same time, another ostracon discovered at the fort of Horvat Uzzah, about 6 kilometers southeast of Tel Arad. We find a letter from one Edomite official, Lumalak, to another, Bilbil. We don't know what vowels there were in this name, BLBL. It's inscribed with a blessing in the name of Kaus, the patron deity of Edom, and a request for food supplies. Third, among other inscriptions, a fragmentary ostracon piece of property with text on it from Horvat Kitmit, an Edomite settlement 6 miles south of Tel Arad. It contains the name of the Edomite deity, Kaus. All of this is evidence that the Edomites were here in the Negev. Fourth, the excavations at Horvat Kitmit provide firm evidence for an Edomite shrine at this place, complete with figurines and other cult objects. This extra-biblical evidence confirms that the Edomites were indeed poised to mock the Judeans as they fell to the Babylonians and to encroach on their territory. The Edomites appear at this time to have been opportunists, switching sides whenever it seemed to their advantage. According to Jeremiah 27, 1-11, as recently as 594 to 593, a mere 5-6 years before Jerusalem fell, the Edomites had been part of an international coalition including Moab, Bnei Ammon, the Ammonites, Tyre, and Sidon, which sent emissaries to Jerusalem to get Zedekiah to join them in rebelling against Nebuchadnezzar. However, when Tyre, the Ammonites, and Judah launched the rebellion, Edom apparently listened to Jeremiah's counsel and withdrew from the alliance. By withdrawing, Edom secured its own existence in the face of the Babylonians, and apparently received permission from Babylon to expand its territory into the Negev, which is Judahite territory. These data provide us with a terminus a quo of Obadiah's prophetic ministry, the earliest possible date. But what about what we call terminus ad quem, the latest possible date? The oracles preserved in the short book obviously assume that Edom still exists as a nation and represents a significant threat to what remains of the Jewish community in Judah, and that they were delivered prior to Edom's fall. That is, these oracles were delivered prior to their fall. We lack clear and unequivocal evidence for that event, but a likely scenario is offered by the Chronicles of Nabonidus, a successor to Nebuchadnezzar, who ruled in Babylon from 556 to 539 BC. The chronicle recording his activities in this region of Palestine, called Palestine today, in 553 BC, Nabonidus' third year, this text reads as follows: the third year, in the month of Av. Now there's some breaks in the text, but you can fill in the blanks. He marched on the Ammananum. Then something about the orchards, fruits, as many as there were. Among them, he brought to Babylon, we don't know, people, things, whatever. The king became ill but recovered. In the month of Kislev, the king mustered his army. And then there's a break. And to Nabu-Tatan-Utsur of Amuru, they set up their quarters facing Edom and the numerous troops. And then there's a reference to killing and whatever else. We don't know exactly what specifically happened. But that seems to be a reference to the Babylonian destruction of the Edomite state. Although the dating is not certain, evidence for the destruction prior to the Persian period has also been found at Busera, Bozrah in the Bible, Tawilan, and Tel el-Khalifa. This region continued to be occupied in the Persian period, but Edom's political and national status had been crushed. Edom is gone. This opened the doors to Nabatean Arabs to move in and take control. Accordingly, we may see in Nabonidus' campaigns the fulfillment of Obadiah's prophecies. We have no direct reference to the fulfillment in the Bible, but this extra biblical evidence gives us good evidence. Let's talk about Obadiah's rhetorical aims and strategy. What is he trying to do, and how is he trying to do it rhetorically? Unlike kings or elders or even priests, prophets wielded no political or legislative or administrative power. Indeed, although false prophets often functioned as lackeys of the royal court, remember Ahab's prophecies in 1 Kings 22, the divinely authenticated prophetic institution in Israel exhibited an ad hoc flavor. Prophets were called and commissioned by Yahweh to address particular circumstances and to declare to the people the mind of God in response to those circumstances. Lacking political power, prophets could not impose their wills on the people. They were preachers, emissaries from the divine court, charged to declare to the people the will and the mind of God. They could not force the people to comply. All they could do was plead with them to turn from their evil ways and to renew their covenant commitments to Yahweh and to their fellow citizens. As preachers, the prophets were rhetoricians whose goal was to transform people's thinking and action and bring these, their thinking and action, into line with Yahweh's will. This meant that their work always involved at least 4 elements: a rhetor, an audience, a message, and a rhetorical strategy. Let's look at these in the book of Obadiah. First, the rhetor. By rhetor here we mean simply the speaker. The speaker. Because prophets generally declared their messages in the first person on behalf of God and often explicitly appealed to divine inspiration for their messages, the true rhetor in a book like Obadiah is Yahweh. In Obadiah, this is reflected in the opening, what we call citation formula. Thus says Adonai concerning Edom. And what follows is a quotation of what God says. It's also found in the twofold occurrence of what I call the signatory formula, the declaration of Yahweh. In the ancient world, written copies, written texts sent by an authority via a messenger were often stamped with a sealed stamp. This signatory formula is the oral equivalent of that. In the course of his proclamation of the message, Obadiah says, the declaration of the Lord Yahweh, the declaration of the Lord Yahweh, so that the people will recognize he's not making this up. He's simply stating what God has told him to say. But then we also find one occurrence of the declaration formula, for Yahweh has spoken, verse 18. Obadiah was Yahweh's authorized spokesman. Yahweh is the principal rhetor. But what can we say about the human rhetor, the messenger, the envoy from the court of heaven? Well, since this prophet is never mentioned elsewhere in the Bible, we are dependent on the book itself for the answer. The heading identifies him simply as Obadiah, which means servant of Yahweh. And this was a common name in Israelite history for several centuries, as is indicated in the First Testament narratives and inscribed seals that archaeologists have found. But servant of Yahweh was also a common epithet for prophets, as in 2 Kings 17:13 and 21:10, my servants the prophets. Obadiah's name alludes to that title. In these contexts, servant does not refer to a menial role, but represents an honorific designation for one specially appointed and commissioned by God. This is why in the New Testament, Paul will alternate between Paul, an apostle of Jesus Christ, or Paul, a servant of Jesus Christ. These are both honorific, not menial titles. In Jeremiah 23:16-22, Yahweh characterizes the true prophets as those who stand in his counsel, his sod. Such was this servant of Yahweh. Unlike the headings to most prophetic books, the present heading tells us nothing more about the prophet than his name. That's the unfortunate thing. We know nothing of his family tree, his place of origin, his prior occupation, or current profession. Either the person responsible for the book in its present form intentionally downplayed the role of the human agent to highlight Yahweh's role, he's the primary rhetor, or this prophet was so well known to the community that he didn't need to be identified any further. So much for the rhetor. What about the audience of the book and message of Obadiah? The opening citation formula, thus has the Lord Adonai Yahweh declared, it ends with the word which we could translate concerning Edom, to Edom, or for Edom, le-Edom. As in cases of inanimate addressees like mountains or lands, and especially in the oracles against foreign nation, when we see this, we need to recognize that the prophet actually had two addressees. There's the hypothetical addressee identified at the head of the prophecy, to Edom, or for Edom, or about Edom. But that's not really the audience to whom he's preaching. The real audience of the prophet is the Jewish people, what's left of the people of Judah. This issue is illustrated most dramatically in Ezekiel's oracles against Bnei Ammon, that's the biblical way of referring to the Ammonite state, and Sidon. Both of these open with what we call the hostile orientation formula. Son of man, direct your face toward, and then you have the name of the hypothetical audience. In these cases, Ezekiel probably physically turned his body so that he was facing that hypothetical addressee. But the utterance that follows was intended for the exiles who were sitting in front of him. Now, while Edom, in our case, may have been Obadiah's grammatical addressee, his primary audience was his own fellow Judahites, those that remained. To answer the question of Obadiah's audience and context, we need to reflect more closely on who these people are, these Judahites, and what is their political, emotional, and spiritual state that he would address them here. He calls them the house of Jacob, verses 17 and 18. In the aftermath of the calamity of 586 BC, members of this household, house of Jacob, were found in 4 geographic contexts. The reference in verse 18 to the house of Joseph is shorthand for the northern kingdom of Israel, which since 931 BC had been led by the tribe of Ephraim, and then the Omrides and their successors who had ruled from Samaria. That's the house of Joseph, the northern kingdom. However, with 2 decisive invasions in 732 and 722 BC, the Assyrians had demolished that state, put an end to the nation, scattered the population that remained throughout the Assyrian Empire, and brought in foreigners to fill in the vacuum left in the land, 2 Kings 17. In effect, the people of the northern kingdom had disappeared from history. They are the house of Jacob, but that element is gone. In the wake of the Babylonian conquest of Judah in 586 BC, the population that survived of Judahites was distributed in 3 principal locations. A few were left in Judah, some had gone down to Egypt, and then some were in Babylon. According to 2 Kings 24, 10-18, in response to Jehoiakim's resistance to Babylonian rule in 597 BC, Nebuchadnezzar had deported to Babylon the cream of the population. That is, those with political and economic power. We have many questions about the exilic social scene, but several features of this remnant in Babylon are clear. First, after the initial humiliation and deportation, King Jehoiakim, whom Babylonian inscriptions refer to as the king of the land of Judah, he was released in Babylon, released from prison. He received special rations from the royal storehouses. And according to 2 Kings 25, 28-30, he dined at the Babylonian king Evil-Merodach's table. While Psalm 137 locates the Judean exiles generally by the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down and wept. Ezekiel's ministry focused on one specific community in Tel Aviv by the Chebar Canal in Babylon, not modern Tel Aviv, but ancient Tel Aviv. Although the experience of deportation had humiliated them, economically the exiles recovered quickly and flourished, so that when Cyrus issued his decree in 539 BC, permitting Judeans to return to Jerusalem, many preferred not to go. They stayed in Babylon. They were doing quite well, thank you. Now, although the Judean exiles integrated quickly into the Babylonian economy and culture, they managed to remain a distinct ethnic and social community. They had their own elders and their own system of family records. We know this from Ezra 2 and Nehemiah 1. Without temple or altar, they also preserved some Israelite religious institutions like circumcision and the Sabbaths. Unfortunately, though, they brought all their tendencies toward idolatry and all kinds of social evils with them to Babylon. So that's the Babylonian group. Some Judeans were also living in colonies in Egypt. Jeremiah 44:1 locates Jewish settlements in Lower Egypt, at Migdol, Tachphanes, and Memphis, and Upper Egypt, Pathros. Numerous papyri from Elephantine, an island in the Nile, attest to a community of Judeans with relative autonomy in internal social affairs. But the religious climate was syncretistic. They celebrated the Passover and the Sabbaths to Yahweh, for whom they had built a temple, but they also worshiped many other deities, which may explain why these Egyptian Jews were largely irrelevant in later history. How about the situation back in Jerusalem? The third location. Archaeological excavations and explorations confirm the complete devastation of the land of Judah in 586 BC. Particularly the major population centers like Jerusalem and Lachish, southwest of Jerusalem. Now, inevitably, among those who remained, a new scum rose to the top to take power. But they were as arrogant and smug as their predecessors. According to Ezekiel 11, who addresses these people in verses 14-16, they had no understanding of their rich religious heritage. They had no sensitivity or pity for their deported country folk, those in Babylon. And even though the prophets had justifiably denounced the people of Judah for their idolatrous and social and criminal ways, throughout the Babylonian crisis, the people had maintained confidence in the Lord's obligation to rescue them. So on the one hand, they were thoroughly orthodox, in their doctrine of eternal security, but on the other hand, they lived like the pagans. In keeping with standard ancient Near Eastern perspective, this sense of security was based on the conviction of an inseparable bond among the national patron deity, Yahweh, the territory, the land of Canaan, which was Yahweh's land, and the people of Yahweh, the Israelites. This is what we call that covenant triangle involving Yahweh, the land, and the people. God was obligated to protect that triangle, but Jerusalem fell. The Davidic house was razed, cut off. The temple was destroyed, and the major portion of the population was exiled for the land. For the few survivors that tried to scrounge out a living out of this environment that remained, the spiritual fallout was more difficult to deal with than the physical distress. Nebuchadnezzar's victory had left them emotionally devastated, raising many questions about Yahweh. Questions of divine impotence. Could he not protect us? Betrayal. Would he not protect us? And abandonment. Why did he leave us? Based on appearances, Marduk, the god of Babylon, had prevailed in that world. The outcome of battles was determined, in the people's minds, by the superiority of the gods. And in this case, when Nebuchadnezzar destroys Jerusalem, it's because Marduk, his god, is stronger than Yahweh, the God of Israel. Far away in Babylon, Ezekiel faced an audience that was equally disillusioned, cynical, bitter, and angry. Ezekiel 33, 30-33. But his prophecies offer hints of what was happening back home in Jerusalem. According to his first temple vision, prior to the fall of Jerusalem, the people at home had introduced all kinds of abominable objects and practices to the temple compound itself. Ezekiel 8, 1-18. And they had filled the land with bloody crimes and the city with injustice. 9:9, 11:6. They did so with cynical justification, saying, Yahweh doesn't see what we're doing. Yahweh has abandoned his land. 8:12, 9:9. And they had this false sense of security within the city. 11:3. Smugly claiming their presence in the land as a mark of Yahweh's favor, and the exiles' absence from the land as a sign of God's judgment on them. A new class seized the property and the power of their exiled countrymen, whose deportation they interpreted as a sign of final divine rejection. 11:15-16. These attitudes seem to harden after the fall of Jerusalem. Ezekiel's response was to declare that Israel's future, which was securely grounded in Yahweh's immutable commitments, but that future rested with the exiles, not with the people back home. Yahweh would bring them back, transform them from the inside out, and reconstitute them, the exiles, as the covenant community. Meanwhile, he had written off the people still in the land. If we assume that Obadiah prophesied in Jerusalem, this was his audience. Since verses 16-21 offer hopes to his hearers, either this prophet's perception of the population of Jerusalem and environs differed fundamentally from his exiled colleague Ezekiel, or he spoke over his immediate audience's heads to the remnants of Israel scattered abroad. The prominence of references to the remnant, verse 17, to exile, verse 20, and the dispossession of land, verses 17 to 20, suggests that Obadiah is actually preaching to the exiles. As in Ezekiel's and Jeremiah's restoration oracles, his aim was to rebuild that audience's hope in the eternal promises of God. That's his audience. Third, what about his message? Responding to the spiritual and theological crisis created by the disaster of 586 BC, Obadiah sought to rekindle hope in his countrymen with two principal points. First, divine justice will prevail with respect to Israel's kinsmen, the Edomites, who had gloated over Judah's fall. Yahweh has not been blind to this filial betrayal. As they have treated the people of Judah, so they will be treated. We will hear more about this. A second lesson. Divine fidelity will prevail with respect to the descendants of Jacob themselves, presently dispersed among the nations and divorced from their homeland. Yahweh had not forgotten his covenant with his people or his promises to the ancestors. That's the message. Fourth, what about his rhetorical strategy? How does he try to get this message across? The old proverb says, good things come in small packages. This is certainly true of the book of Obadiah. In order to grasp the message of the book, we need to consider several features of its rhetoric. How does he try to make these points? First, Obadiah adopts a style that is rhetorically emphatic and transparently passionate. This is not a cold academic essay on what's wrong in Judah or in Babylon. It is a passionate plea. Although in our Hebrew text, Obadiah 1 to 18 is laid out as poetry and verses 19 to 21 are formatted as prose, most English translations cast the whole book as poetry. And when I started my work on the book, that's what I expected to find. But after subjecting it to generic tests used to distinguish between poetry and prose, I have concluded that the style of Obadiah is a far cry from the pure poetry that we find in Hannah's song in 1 Samuel 2, 1 to 10, or many of the Psalms. If this is poetry, the word itself has lost all meaning. But at the same time, neither is it smoothly flowing narrative or didactic prose. Coldly, objectively, and logically recounting events and presenting truth. Perhaps we do best to classify its style as what I call a heightened form of rhetoric. This is impassioned speech that attempts to transform the minds and hearts of the audience, replacing cynicism and doubt with confidence and hope. Like the rest of the prophets, Ezekiel and Jeremiah and Isaiah, Obadiah was first and foremost a preacher, steeped in traditional theology, with a firm command of the principles of rhetoric and passionate in his zeal for Yahweh. Second, Obadiah intentionally appealed in his rhetoric to higher authorities. Although he did not identify himself as a prophet, through his use of prophetic formulas, we've talked about those already, he has made clear that his message was not his own. He didn't design it. This is not his wishful thinking. Since his message came directly from Yahweh, God, his audience must accept it as an expression of the divine will, the divine disposition, and the divine determination. But Obadiah did not only listen to the voice of God directly, he also heard it through intermediaries. In verse 1, he separates the divine citation formula from the cited text with a curious reference to a report from Yahweh that we have heard through an envoy that has been sent. This message is not for Israel, but for the nations who are charged to engage Edom in war. But who's the messenger? Now, the word for envoy here could refer to a human messenger, as it does in Proverbs 13:17 or Isaiah 18:2. But the sense of the word is confirmed in the first two texts by its association with another word for messenger, the envoy. Since this envoy goes from Yahweh to the nations, here and in Jeremiah 49:14, this is best interpreted as a celestial, angelic figure, presumably a member of the heavenly council. In any case, both the nations and Obadiah viewed that message as authoritative in verse 1 and 2. But Obadiah had also heard the voice of Yahweh through his professional predecessors, prophets who came before him. This short book offers a magnificent study in intertextuality because at least one half of the total text involves adaptations of prior prophecies. The most obvious source is Jeremiah's oracle against Edom in Jeremiah 49:9-10 and then 14-16, echoes of which we hear in Obadiah 1-6. We'll have more to say about these borrowings as we work our way through the book. While the list of Obadiah's expressions and motifs echoing earlier texts and traditions is impressive, it doesn't exhaust the evidence of dependence. We should note especially that in accordance with Deuteronomy 30, verse 7, with his invectives against Edom, Obadiah pronounced on Israel's enemy the broad categories of curses with which Yahweh had originally threatened his own people in Deuteronomy 28. Should they persist in rebelling against him. But the same applies to the messages of hope after judgment for Israel. His message of hope was based on the ancient promises that devastation and exile couldn't be Yahweh's last word for Israel. He would act with compassion and in fidelity to his ancient commitments and ultimately restore his people to himself and to their land. We find this clearly stated in Leviticus 26:40-45, Deuteronomy 4:29-31, and Deuteronomy 30:1-10. Obadiah is steeped in the scriptures, both the Torah, that is the first 5 books, especially Leviticus and Deuteronomy, but he has also been studying the prophets' other messages that came before him. We conclude with a quick look at the structure of Obadiah. Unlike some prophetic oracles which flow smoothly and exhibit a clear structure, Obadiah is difficult to outline. Verse 1 obviously functions as an introduction. So far, so good. We're safe here. It establishes the context of Obadiah's prophecy and the rest of the book. And the rest of the book represents a collage of prophetic pronouncements. It's clear that the prophecy proper, after verse 1, consists of a major section devoted to denouncing Edom, verses 1 to 14, then a shorter section intended to build hope in Israel, verses 16 to 21. But even the boundary between these two sections is blurred. Does verse 15 belong with what comes before or with what follows? The first line looks like the beginning of a new section, but the second and third lines seem to fit better with what precedes. Well, there's no doubt that Obadiah's prophecy contains the elements of a legal case, indictment and sentence, which might support those who interpret it, that is, this book, in terms of a covenant lawsuit. But Obadiah is not prone to live according to our rules. Rather than beginning logically with the indictment, which is what usually happens in Jeremiah and Ezekiel and other prophets, and then giving the judgment, Obadiah declares Edom's fate first, verses 2 to 9, and then he describes their crimes, verses 10 and following, 10 to 14. This is backwards, at least according to our logic. And then finally, he announces the implications of the judgment of Edom for the nations, verses 15 to 16, and for Israel, verses 17 and then 19 to 21, with a final declaration of Edom's fate inserted in verse 18. So the structure is awkward and difficult to identify. But the entire unit is held together by the word day, yom, which occurs 12 times in 21 verses. In terms of proportion, by word count, the center of gravity lies in the second part of the book, the judgment of Esau on his day of doom. But based on the discourse markers, the prophecy reaches its climactic section in verses 15 to 18, with verse 17 marking the absolute pinnacle. We'll talk more about all of this in detail later. In the studies that follow, I shall present my interpretation under the following headings. A, introduction, setting the stage for the days. I said day is the key word. That's verse 1. B, the judgment, Esau's humiliation on the day of doom, verses 2 to 10. Third, the indictment, Esau's crimes on the day of Jacob, verses 11 to 14. D, the bad good news, the demise of Esau on the day of Yahweh, verses 15 to 18. It's bad good news. It's bad because it's bad for Edom, but it's good for Judah. And finally, E, the good news, the restoration of Jacob on the day of Yahweh. That is the climax of the book.